Hello, my name is Ian Scales, you're watching TelecomTV, and we're here at Smart IoT London, where I'm going to be talking with Jeremy Green from Machina Research. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks.
We want to talk about cars. I know that's a strange thing to talk about at an IoT event, but
Cars are things?
Cars are things, and you've been following them for quite a while now in an IoT sense.
Mm-hmm.
So what have you been thinking about recently?
Well, I think part of what's happening with connected cars and why the car makers are so keen to get involved in this and to put themselves in, if you'll pardon the expression, the driving seat,
Yes,
is because what they are frightened of, what I can't but help call Carmageddon. And Carmageddon is the scenario in which they follow the PC manufacturers and the mobile phone manufacturers and become basically makers of commodity hardware platforms.
yes.
And the primary relationship of the customer becomes either with Google through Android Auto or with Apple through CarPlay.
You can see that happening a bit already, can't you, in their own terms, because people, the other side of this is that people don't value the car like they used to. They're quite willing to let it go into hire and to Uber and to do lots of other things to get around.
Absolutely.
And that must fit into that as well.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of talk of peak car. Right now in the UK we're in a slightly odd situation where actually car sales here have picked up, but in a lot of the world car sales are in the doldrums. In all the places where we know that the economy is in trouble.
Yeah.
Whether that's Brazil or Eastern Europe or China, all the sales of cars are falling off, and they're falling off worst in the bits that the car makers always used to like best, which is the mid-range. Like a lot of things, the car market is polarizing into a sort of small premium luxury bit and a value bit down at the bottom, and the car makers actually would make more money from those mid-range big saloons, but the sort of the bells and whistles part of that market in a lot of places is falling away.
Right.
And the part of the downside of the I'll call it Androidization, but it's not just Android, it's at the very least it's Apple as well.
Yeah.
Part of the downside of that is actually even in the most basic car you can still have the same all singing all dancing head unit that does all the same stuff, whether you don't need to have the luxury model to have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In the same way that my Android phone might be a cheapo Android phone, but it's still got exactly the same operating system.
Yes.
I can have all the same apps.
Yes. That's really interesting, isn't it? So how are you characterising this?
Well, I am calling it Carmageddon because it's kind of the nightmare scenario for
Right.
car makers, and they're doing various things to try to stave it off and maintain themselves as being the keystone of the value chain. The most extreme example of that is what BMW is doing, I think, whereby their head unit and their software ecosystem has they have their own app store. So if you want to buy maps for the BMW head unit, you have to buy the maps for them, and they cost hundreds of euros. Whereas, if you had a Android Google in-car unit,
Yes.
all the maps are there for nothing.
And probably just as good, really.
Yeah,
Maybe.
and possibly better.
Yes,
You've
yes.
got the alternative if you're in an environment which is more open than the BMW one. Well, if you don't like the Google Maps, you could install Waze, or you could install
Yes.
somebody else's maps.
Yes.
With BMW, you can install somebody else's, but it's much more tailored towards BMW controlling the customer experience.
Okay, so
Via their head unit and their gatekeeper app. If you want to install things, you do it via their app that you put on your phone, and that's the way you get stuff on.
So it's a sort of Apple play, isn't it?
It is. I mean, one of the things I've speculated about is, in a world of commodity hardware platforms, who is going to be the Apple of the car market. It might be Apple.
Yeah, it could be Apple. Yeah.
Because, there's talk about Apple
Could be
building
Google.
cars, actually building them. They don't build anything, but commissioning cars that will be, they'll all be white, and they'll be the Apple car, and it'll only work with an iPhone and with your Apple fridge and whatever.
Yes.
But Apple users will love it because
Yes.
it will be Apple.
Exclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where are we going to end up with all of this then? Are we looking at BMW, for instance, failing with its walled garden approach? Every other walled garden has failed in the past.
It's possible. I mean, if I had to bet my own money, I think probably most walled garden approaches will fail. It's possible that there are a few cars, and it might not be BMW, it might be Bentley or somebody like that, where the person who owns them actually does care more about the car brand than they care about their software brand, or even their software experience.
Yeah.
It's driven. Maybe it's driven by a chauffeur. They don't even care, or maybe it's so aspirational for them to have the BMW that they care more about the BMW than they care about their smartphone experience.
Yeah.
For most people, that's not true. It's funny to hear the car makers talk about their unparalleled expertise in designing user experiences, because their user experiences are mainly quite bad.
Yes.
And even if they weren't bad, what you want is the same user experience that you have on other things, not the same experience that you had on the last brand of car that you owned. You want it to be the same as what you see when you're on your desktop, and the same as what you see when you're on your tablet and so on, not the same as the car that you last owned.
Yes. So that's not going to build loyalty.
I
Not
don't
spending
think
huge
so.
amounts of money is not going to get them loyalty in that
No,
direction.
and they work to much slower cycles than the Googles and Androids. I mean, my Android phone updates itself every few months. The car makers are now producing things that they thought about 5 years ago.
Right.
It's not.
It's that sort of difference. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the shape of the market then, in terms of infotainment and the digital stuff that they're plunking in the cars. What's your view on the autonomous car, and whether, when and how that's going to come about? Because in some senses, of course, that gets around the infotainment problem, because if you don't have to drive the thing anymore.
You could really, you could watch a movie.
You could watch a movie. You're back into entertainment land.
I think there's two questions here. Well, there's lots of questions.
There's lots of questions.
Yeah. One thing is, first of all, I don't know. I don't know really when our roads will be full of self-driving cars, and anybody who tells you that they know is either they don't know either.
Yes.
The question number one is, to some extent, it's a computing power problem. We know it's going to take a lot of computing power. We know that computing power gets cheaper all the time, and there gets more of it all the time, but we don't know how much. We don't know how much computing power it's going to take to run a car, not on a stretch of open motorway, but in the streets of London or the streets of Mumbai or so on, because we don't know how hard a problem that is. They can do simulations in test beds in Palo Alto or whatever, and they can see that they can actually make it dodge around a bollard, or they can make two self-driving cars avoid each other at speed, and it's brilliant what they've done, and no hats off to them. But what it amounts to when you have to do that little flick of the eyelids, that thing that you do to somebody waiting to cut out in front of you in the lane, or an old lady with a trolley. They can sense the old lady with a trolley. Can they sense that she's nodded to you and you've nodded back to her, or not? So we don't know how much computing power that's going to take, or whether it's ever going to be enough. So that's one question. The second question is this an incremental journey, which is what the car makers think? They think that we're going to get there gradually by adding more and more assisted driver features. So, right now, in a sort of high to mid-range car, it might park itself. You've got adaptive cruise control and things like that. They're all great. It's clever that we've got those things. Whether that will gradually turn into a car that drives itself more and more, or whether the alternative scenario, which is the one that the Google car guys sketch out, which is that you don't learn to fly by jumping higher and higher, and that we'll never get to a self-driving car if you just try to add ADAS features. I don't know.
Where do you go?
I'm reluctant to find myself on the same side of an argument as the car makers, but it seems to me that we might never get to, a bit like moonshots, you know. The point of the moonshot was all the things that we got on the way, because we never got the manned base on the moon. The moon base wasn't being used to, you know, we didn't mine the moon. We didn't do all the things they sold the moon landings to us on.
Yeah.
But there were lots of other bits of technology that came out of it.
I suppose the calculation is that it's no good having a partly driving car, because that would be the most unsafe thing of all, when somebody thinks that the car's helping them, when it's not, when those extreme situations come up and it doesn't
All this
work.
stuff is, you know, there are not standards exactly, but there are blueprint documents which exist about what the requirements are for the car to be able to hand over to human driving again. So, you know, 10 years ago, I drove a car in Australia that had adaptive cruise control, and yeah, it did quite a lot. And every so often, it stopped doing it, and you had to take over the braking and the accelerating again, and that's sort of established.
Yeah.
So I don't think you're right.
You think
I think there
get
is some value in cars that will do some stuff by themselves, lane departure warnings, lane correction, and they can do quite a lot of quite clever stuff that takes some of the misery out of driving. And you can see where I'm coming from there. But takes some of the misery out of driving without it being completely self-driving.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful in a built-up urban, you know, when you're in the rush hour and everything. You just
Well, I think that's
relax.
probably that's the least likely place you're
Okay.
going to get it. But you know, on a motorway, which is the safest place to drive anyway. Funnily enough, it doesn't feel like it, but it is. Then you can have more that will help you on highways.
Jeremy Green, Machina Research, thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.